Tonight's speaker is David Streatfield, and it's an autobiographical speech, so there seems no point in introducing him, in that he's going to tell us all about himself. So without further ado, over to you, David.
In case you're worried, I'm really not going to tell you all about myself. Just one episode in my life. It was actually at the point where I decided that, having spent quite a long time as a consultant, that I would start to wind my company down. And I started to wind the company down. And as part of this kind of general relaxation, I was talking to my wife about South Africa. Because we're talking now about the early 2000s, and we were interested in how South Africa had been developing, particularly because we had, as honourable citizens, made sure that we'd never visited South Africa under apartheid. So, and then it happened that we saw a conference being advertised. If you're into evaluation, then you'll know about the Northumbria Conference, which was imaginatively named because the first such conference was held in Northumbria. But they then got more imaginative and decided that they would run one in South Africa. And they got even more imaginative because they decided that the only place to run a conference in South Africa is the Spear Wine Estate, which just happens to have a conference hotel. So we decided we would go to the Spear Wine Estate. Now the catch here is that my wife is an academic, and so in order to get her fare paid and her conference fee paid, she needed to get a paper accepted. So we wrote a paper based on a book which we just published called Evaluating the Impact of Your Library. And if you're interested, I've given you a handout about it. So we decided to deliver the paper, offer a paper. It was accepted. And then a word came out saying that the academics in South Africa are at a disadvantage compared with academics in the, I'm going to say the Western world, because they don't have the travel opportunities. So would anybody who's coming to the conference to give a paper, would they be prepared to run a workshop based on what they're doing? So we thought, yeah, we'll run a workshop for South African academics on evaluating the impact of libraries. So that's what we did. And we arrived to run the workshop, and it was gratifyingly full. And just before we started, somebody came up and said, I can see you're full, but would you mind if I observed your session? And I'm thinking, I said, no problem, sit at the back. And then at the coffee break, she came up and said, would you mind if I brought two of my colleagues to observe your session? Now at this point, I'm trying to work out, and I'd started looking at the delegates list, but I couldn't see the link. And at the end of the session, she came up and introduced herself as a program officer from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, working on the Global Libraries program, which I'll tell you a little bit about in a moment. And they got to the point where they realised that just doing performance measurement wasn't going to get them into the position that they needed to be as part of the Global Libraries program, as part of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, which takes evaluation very seriously. And so they asked us if we would come on board to help them with the impact evaluation of the program. At this point, they were fully expecting us to say yes. The person I'm talking about told me afterwards that she was really surprised when we said, we need time to think about this. Can we come back tomorrow and talk to you then? So we went back, and essentially why we wanted time to talk or to think was because what we didn't want to do was to get in the business of warming up markets for Microsoft. So we came back with a whole series of questions about the relationship between the foundation and Microsoft. And they were able to tell us about the antitrust legislation in the States, which essentially means that if any of the Microsoft competitors could show that the foundation was getting a competitive advantage from having the foundation, then the foundation would lose its charitable status, and that would have horrible implications for the foundation. So they go way out of their way not to get into that territory. And it's also why they talk a lot about advocacy. One of the themes of the Global Libraries Programme is to try to produce evidence of the change that you're bringing about by intervening in public libraries in the countries which are ready for it. That's the essence of what they're doing. And what they want to be able to do is to show that they are making significant change by changing people's lives through having free public access to the internet and all that it holds, and provided by people who've been trained to help people find information on the internet. And that's in essence what the Global Libraries Programme has been doing. So it's been about trying to bridge the gap between the information rich and the information poor in countries where there's sufficient of a public library system to use that as a vehicle. It's not the only vehicle. From my perspective, and I'll tell you why in a minute, the most interesting country is Vietnam, where if you go into the more rural parts of Vietnam, there are no public libraries. But what they do have there is a post office system left over from the French. And it's a post office system which was a kind of central part of the community in small communities. And they still invest in it by sending young graduates to work as post office managers in these small communities. And they decided that the Global Libraries Programme could use that network of what they call community post offices to provide free public access to the internet, providing computers, training those staff, and so on, which was interesting. Interesting as in it took 4 years for people on the programme to realise why the rural post offices were not functioning as well as had been anticipated. Because the rural post offices had lost most of their previous function with the kind of emergence of the internet and with mobile phones. So there wasn't a whole lot of post office activity, but there was some. The result of this was that quite typically in these rural communities, in the afternoon, the post office manager would close the post office and go and deliver the post. And nobody noticed. And it took 4 years, and it was only when we were doing sort of fairly careful monitoring of the use of the computers that we discovered that in a whole lot of rural areas, the computers were never used in the afternoons. So if you ask the right question, you get the right answer. So that's a kind of diversionary line. So what I did in effect was to find myself having got the right replies from Global Libraries, and I must say that all of the replies stood up, and I've been working with them for 10 years, and not only are they very principled in everything that they're doing, but they are, I would say, and I'm thinking now about all of the conversations and all of the stuff written about learning organisations over the last 20 years. I think I can safely say that as a consultant, the only organisation I've ever worked for that could truly be regarded as a learning organisation was the Global Libraries Programme at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And that's because they listen, they learn, and they try not to make the same mistakes in the same way twice. And the other side of it is that they have applied the best of management principles to the running of a charitable foundation. And it's really very interesting to watch. And I'll give you a couple of instances of that in a moment, if you can last that long. So that's how I stumbled into the Global Libraries Programme. I was just in the right place at the right time. And what I found interesting is that over that period of time, I counted the other day that there were 35 consultancy companies employed in some way by the Global Libraries Programme. There were 2 left. The other consultancy company is a very large advocacy company, which has, and as an aside, I was talking to the person I work closely with in that company, who is one of their kind of senior folk. And she'd spent quite a lot of her time briefing Obama when he was president. She was asked to do the same thing, or the company was asked to do the same thing with Donald Trump. And they decided within half an hour that he was unbriefable. So I better not mention their name at this point. Kelly, are you listening? I'm now going to just mention a couple of the other areas, because one of the things that happens if you get involved in something like Global Libraries is that you're visible. And so you get asked to do other things. And I've been very lucky in those other things too, because I've been doing quite a lot of evaluation stuff for IFLA, and for an organisation called the International Development Research Centre, which is based in Canada, and does what it says. It's essentially researches international development interventions, and has a very strong focus on evaluation as a result. And we've been employed as a consultant by them. I was employed for 2 weeks in Bulgaria by the United Nations Development Programme. I say that purely because if you're short of any questions at the end, you may like to ask about that. And depending on how drunk I am, I will tell you everything more or less of the answer. And I'm also involved with something called the Reading and Writing Foundation, which is a European community-based organisation, run by one of the princesses in Belgium. And I've never actually worked out which one. She's married into the family, so she's got a perception of, shall we say, proper work in the real world, and that foundation is also very interesting. So what I'm going to do now, if you'll bear with it, is just talk a little bit about Global Libraries and its approach to evaluation, because that's what I do, and then I'm going to offer you some survival tips based on my experience of working as an international consultant, and then I'm open to questions. Okay? So, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, I need to distinguish between the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation approach to evaluation and the Global Libraries Programme within that foundation and their approach to evaluation, which is quite different. I am quite significantly responsible for that difference. And there are some people in the foundation who hate me as a result. But it was a very interesting battleground, I think you could describe it as, for evaluation. Because essentially, the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation takes an attribution-based approach to evaluation. So they want to be able to show that because they did this in this country, this happened. And that nothing else could have caused it. And they also would like to go the step further and say, if we did this rather than that, we would get a better result. Now that works if you're doing things like, and the example I always quote is purifying wells in Africa. which is something that the Gates Foundation has spent a lot of money on, where the programme is really complex, because what you've got to do there is to engage with local communities and get them to change the practices of not only a lifetime, but several lifetimes. That you really, you've got to get significant change happening and bought into by everybody concerned. If you actually succeed in doing that, then the evaluation is fairly straightforward. What you do is you look at the death rate from waterborne diseases in the communities that you're working in, and since there will be nothing else going on the ground, if the death rate from waterborne diseases or the incidence of waterborne diseases is declining, then you know what's caused it. So you can make a causal relationship. I got into global libraries, and I was soon arguing to the evaluation team, and it used to be fun. I used to fly over to Seattle to meet the evaluation team, and I would go in representing global libraries, and if I was lucky, the director of the programme had come along, so there'd be 2 of us against 12 of them. But on occasion, I was solo, and would have anything from 10 to 12 members of the evaluation team. And I got talking to them afterwards, and they admitted that they used to come along largely because it was entertainment for them, to have somebody arguing a wholly different approach to evaluation, and managing to get some headway. So what I was saying was that the Global Libraries programme was kind of opposite, because the programme itself was fairly straightforward. What would happen is that global libraries would find a country that wanted to engage in their programme, would then encourage a proposal to be prepared for funding. The interesting bit of that was that they then gave money to a partner in the country who would prepare the proposal so that they could prepare a proper proposal, and also so that global libraries could insist that, for example, the proposal would be based upon consultation with people in the communities which the programme was hoping to help. So that was a requirement. And that was the kind of the pattern of the Global Libraries intervention. Once the funding arrived, the country team would be put together, usually by their partner, and the country team would have in it an impact evaluation specialist. So that once I came on board with Global Libraries, all of the country teams had an impact specialist, who was somebody that I would work directly with in the countries. And there were other members of the team responsible for advocacy, because Global Libraries made the connection between impact evaluation and evidence-based advocacy. They wanted to be able to show what difference they were making, and then be able to empower the library managers in the country to argue the case for more funding, for better funding, or continued funding for public libraries in those countries, based on good advocacy practice. And so that was essentially, the main elements of the programme are joint funding with the country, but with the global libraries providing the bigger element usually, sufficient to put an adequate number of computers into the libraries that were going to be part of the programme, which might be all of the libraries in the country, public libraries in the country, or a proportion of them. So that in India, for example, the Global Libraries programme is currently working with 230 public libraries, which in a country of the size of India is minuscule. But what they're hoping to do is to demonstrate that the approach that they're taking really has purchase and can make a difference. And they've got a big program behind that, which will be about, they call it the India Public Library Movement. So you can see they're ambitious in their program. So the funding is provided to put the computers into the libraries, to train the library staff not just to use the computers, but to be able to help people to find the information that they want using the computers. And then they do advocacy training, and that's it really. So the pattern in most countries is fairly straightforward. So it's a fairly straightforward program, but the evaluation is incredibly complex, because what you're saying is we are taking people who do not have free public access to the internet. We're giving them free public access to the internet. They will use it in whatever ways they want. We have no idea how they're going to use it, and we're going to evaluate it. So as you can see, it's quite a challenge. But it's a fascinating challenge, and as I said, I've been working on it for 10 years, and I'm having a fantastic time doing it. So that's the kind of the battleground was the way it was resolved was that we decided to resolve it around language. So that if you look at anything from the Global Libraries Programme, they will talk about impact assessment. They don't talk about impact evaluation, because the evaluation team at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation says, what you're doing is not impact evaluation, we'll call it impact assessment and we'll go away, which is fine. Yeah. So we've ring-fenced that programme, which means that their focus is on attribution, our focus is on contribution. So what we look for is what we're doing in the country making a contribution to enabling people to get at information, to use it in ways that they want to do. And we've identified 7 areas where we know that public libraries can make a difference. They range through things like education, health, e-governance, if the country is at that stage where e-governance is significant, communication, and then a cluster of things around economic development and job seeking and rural development, which varies from country to country. And one of the interesting things about the programme is that having kind of set a kind of global scene, they then talk about localisation. So evaluation in global library speak means there are certain things that all countries have to do. They need to collect some performance data, and this was actually chosen by the impact specialists that I talked about in the different countries. They worked with the Global Libraries team and with me to come up with a minimum set of data which global libraries needed to be able to tell the story of change to Bill and Melinda Gates, but the countries themselves needed as well. So there's a common performance measurement system, and there's also a common impact measurement system, which is actually a con. It's a confidence trick perpetuated by various people, including me, because the director of Global Libraries wanted to be able to show some numbers which showed that Global Libraries was having an impact in each country. And they did this by interviewing samples of people in the communities and asking them questions about whether they had used the public access computers to do a whole range of things. And it's a con in the sense that it is all self-reported. And the shortfall in it, from my perspective, and I don't shout about this too much in global libraries, but the shortfall is that whenever you look at the data, you're left asking, okay, in what way? So that people are saying that they use public library computers to get educational information about, let's say, informal education or opportunities for their children in higher education. And what I want to know is what happened next. And I'd love to be in a position where I could ask systematically, on the scale that Global Libraries does it, what happened next. Now, we can't do that, but what we can and do is we focus on collecting stories of change in each of the countries. They're collected in different ways in different countries, but those stories of change are what drives the impact work from my perspective. Now, I'll tell you a story. I said in my little intro piece that I wrote for you that I'm going to talk about the delights of the programme. One of the delights for me is working with one of the 3 NGOs, non-government organisations working in Brazil, each with a cluster of public libraries. Now that says to me now that this means that the public library system in the country doesn't work very effectively as a system because Global Libraries chose to work with NGOs who would engage with individual public libraries rather than try and do it through the system. And this has happened in a number of countries for variations on the same reason. It's happening in India because Global Libraries know that if they took the whole of their grant and put it into one of the states in India, and that's may not be a bad idea, because if you think that one of the states we're working with is Uttar Pradesh. Now, if Uttar Pradesh was a country, it would be the 5th largest country in the world. That's one state in India. So if we took the whole of the grant and put it into, and I'll malign them now, put it into Uttar Pradesh, there would be no way of tracking where that money went through the system. And that's not necessarily corruption, it's simply because the bureaucracy would take over and nothing would happen. So, as in Brazil, as in India, we've got NGOs that we're working with who are working directly with the public libraries. Now, one of these NGOs, that the team were disciples of Paulo Freire. Does the name mean anything to anyone? Book Aid International have cited Freire in a number of ways. Yes, I've been doing some work with him, by the way, but I'll tell you about that later. Yeah, he was a priest originally, and he did a lot of very interesting work on educational interventions which were aimed at empowering people through learning. And this particular project team has, inculcated Freire's ideas, and they deliberately chose an area of Brazil where there is a huge crime rate, gun crimes, murders, you name it. And the common factor was that none of the library staff worked in the community which they focused on. They would live in a neighbouring community which is safer. So if people are then going into work, how do you engage with the community? And what they did was to run training courses for the library staff, but also for a group of people who were chosen because they lived in the community. They deliberately focused on young people. Young people living in the community, got them involved, and they then literally built bridges out to the community to try to bridge that gap and create a community engagement. Now, from the evaluation perspective, why I think that's a wonderful project is, well, 2 reasons. One was that when it came to evaluating that programme, they looked at the results framework, which is provided by the Gates Foundation, which has in it all the inputs, processes, outputs, outcomes, short-term outcomes, long-term outcomes, you name it, and said, this doesn't work for us. What we're doing is working with a bunch of people to try to get them to really engage our community. How can we express that in these terms? And I said to them, don't worry about it. I'll fight your corner. What I suggest you do is use the power that you've got. You are engaging with people in the community, through the young people, through the librarians. Give them some technology so that they can record what they're doing and get them to collect their own stories of change. So they did, essentially, do that. And the really interesting one was one of the communities which was so bad that they had a guard on the door with a gun, in uniform, and he went to the training along with everybody else in the team. As a result of which, he decided that he was part of the problem rather than part of the solution. So he stopped wearing his uniform to work, and he left his gun at home. That was one that I thought was really interesting as an impact. The other one was that they looked at the absenteeism rate amongst the library staff. And when they started, it was dramatic. There was a lot of people who were having to go to work in a hostile community, in a not very safe place. Why wouldn't you find an excuse not to go to work? And within about a year of starting this programme, the absenteeism rate dropped like that. And I've seen all of the data, and it's really quite dramatic because suddenly these people have got a reason to get up in the morning, and they can actually go in and do stuff. And as a huge change, that made me very happy. Just hearing about this. And we've got lots of other stories. In Romania, because they think on their feet. If you think about a public library, how many of you would immediately think about the farmers, bearing in mind that Romania is part of the European community? Subsidies, farming subsidies. How do you get a farming subsidy in Romania? Well, how you used to do it was you went to one of 4 centres in Romania, and you joined the queue of people waiting, and when you got to the front of the queue, you were faced with a form to fill in which you could not possibly understand. And if you managed to get through the form, you would find that there were 6 documents that you needed, which you hadn't got. So you had to go away again and start the whole process again. And there was a way, of course, of ensuring that you could get the forms filled in. But what they did was, starting with one of the areas of Romania, but now they've rolled it out to the whole country, they trained the library staff to help the farmers to fill in these forms. They were not only able to track how many farmers had filled in the forms to get this subsidy money which was waiting there for them, but how much money they got for each of the, I'm going to call them provinces, they talk about counties there, but that doesn't mean quite the same as a county here. So, but let's stick with counties. So they are able to tell the politicians in each county how much money had gone into the county from this programme as a result of the intervention of the library staff, and to get stories from the library staff, from the farmers themselves, and from the local officials. And they were all put together, county by county, and they sent these stories out annually to tell the story of change. So, there's so much that you can do, and these are the sorts of things that I've had the huge pleasure of doing with global libraries. I will try and wind up fairly quickly from here. Other stuff that I'm doing, I've been working with the team, the Global Libraries team, in the ways that I described, getting them some space to work in so that they could do an evaluation that was appropriate, and then helping to devise, develop various tools, the Common Impact Measurement System, the Common Performance Measurement System. But the biggest part of my work has been doing technical assistance in some of the countries of global libraries. I've worked in a fair bit in 10 countries, in Eastern Europe, Africa, Caribbean, and South and Southeast Asia, so specifically India, Indonesia, and Vietnam. So, and I worked out recently that if you take just the flights to and from the places I've been to, 4 global libraries over the last 10 years, it gets me to the moon and nearly all the way back, but not quite. Some of you might think it's a brilliant idea that it's not quite. But so, you know, I spend a lot of time and I work with the impact specialist in each country. In most cases, the impact specialist, when recruited, didn't have the full range of skills needed to do the job. Because you're talking about qualitative research, quantitative research, library statistics, and something around community development. And you know, everybody has got weaknesses in those areas. So I was working with people on their weaker areas and helping them to get stronger. And it's been just amazing seeing how well these people have developed in all sorts of strange ways. I mean, in Chile, for example, we had the impact specialist there who was a social anthropologist before he got into impact evaluation. And he is now the director of the National Museum in Santiago in Chile. As an immediate, you know, he went straight from the impact job to that job. So I think, you know, you could say he progressed. He's also got some very interesting tattoos on his arms, which were the result of negotiating into a local community in a remote part of Chile when he was an anthropologist. As he said, he spent an evening getting friendly with the elders of the tribe, if you like, the elder people. And at some point in the evening, they said, "Would you like more drink?" And he said, "Yes, sure." You know. And, "Would you like to smoke some interesting things?" "Yes, sure." And then it was, "Would you like a tattoo?" And they're really quite remarkable, the tattoos. I've seen them. I've got photographs of them. Because I knew his weakness. I got him drunk and then got him to show me. However, so I've seen all of that happening. I also do work with the INELI program. Have you heard of INELI? I can't honestly say that I know what it stands for, except that it is the Public Library Development Program, which started out as a global program, so that they were bringing in people from various countries around the world, and they've now made it regional, as in regions of the world. And I work with, in fact, last week I was in Athens for the INELI Balkans convening, and they're training leaders and identifying, they call them innovators, they're kind of the next generation of leaders. And they're doing this on a big scale. And again, I'm having a lot of fun, you know, trying to help them to ensure that in their work on leadership, they're focusing around evaluating impact as part of what they're doing. And the kind of final element of my work is that I said that Global Libraries is a learning organisation. One of the ways in which we want to learn is to help other people to learn from our learning. And so one of the things that we've done is to take over 2 issues of a journal with a riveting title, Performance, Measurement and Metrics in Libraries. I've given you the reference there. There are 2 issues of that journal which consist entirely of telling the story of global libraries' evaluation work. And so if I've got any of you even slightly interested in what I've been doing, you can find out a lot more about what has been going on by looking at those 2 issues. When I did the first one, I was on my way to Indonesia. Quite literally, I was actually at the front door, the phone rang. I answered the phone, and it was from Performance, Measurement and Metrics, to say that they had brought forward the date of publication by 1 month for the publication. So could they have all of the copy for this special issue, bearing in mind that this copy is in nearly every case written by somebody whose first, second, third or fourth language may not be English. Yeah. Could we have all a copy in presentable form by the end of that month? So I went to the airport and I sent emails all round, which was just as well, because when I got into Indonesia, I was in the middle of Java, where the internet connectivity is, I think you would say, a little bit iffy. And I was trying to get the text from everybody and send it back with, editing suggestions and, whatever. And it was supposed to be an iterative process. Try doing that in the steaming Java jungle. It was a total nightmare. But I knew that we'd really succeeded with the program at the point where the last of those contributions came in. Everybody delivered, including somebody who'd gone on paternity leave. And he went into his office, wrote the piece for me, and then went back on paternity leave. And somebody else who got a very severe case of flu, and she wrote it from her sickbed. And apart from it wandering in a couple of places, it was, a really good contribution. So I just, you can imagine how I felt at the end of that. And what the foundation did, they gave me a sort of carte blanche to negotiate it. The original deal that I did with Emerald, the publisher who produced Performance Measurement and Metrics, and also the Library Review journal, is that anything that has global libraries in it, the original deal was that it would be on open access to anybody who wanted it 9 months after publication, because it is a subscription journal. But that was the deal. And then with the second special issue, which we did 2015, the foundation paid up front to ensure that from day one, everything published in there would be public access. So if you're interested, just go online and you can see all of the contributions to both those journal issues. Now, the last thing I promised to do was to give you some tips for survival in this environment. I've got 4. First one is beware of cultural imperialism. If you think, you know something will work here because it worked there, forget it. You really, you have to start from the opposite end and really look at the situation and see what you think might work and talk to the people about what might work and see whether they think it might work. And if you all agree that it might work, well, it might work. So, it's that kind of process. And it certainly isn't, this is the way to do it. And that's kind of complicated by the fact that not only do you not understand the culture if you're working parachuted in from outside, but you don't necessarily share a common set of concepts. So I've talked about impact evaluation. Common factor is that apart from the English-speaking countries I've worked in, none of them had a word for impact in the way in which I assume that you will understand it when I talk about impact. If you're talking about the impact of a program on people, then they didn't have a word for it. And that was the common factor. And I mentioned assessment, using the word assessment. I have difficulties with using the word assessment in relation to impact, because for me, in the UK context, impact assessment is about student performance. But for global libraries, it means what we think of as impact evaluation. So we need to have a common understanding, or at least a halfway house in understanding. And I use that term deliberately because I discovered that in the USA, halfway house means something entirely different from what it means in the UK. And Advocacy is another word. The reason that Global Libraries is big on using the word advocacy is back to the antitrust legislation. Because what they must not be doing as a charitable foundation is lobbying. And since a lot of what advocacy is about trying to persuade politicians and people in positions to make decisions that they should be making a particular kind of decision, it's a very dangerous area for global libraries and for the foundation. So we talk about advocacy. What I find fascinating is that when I was working in Lithuania at the end of their program, and again in Romania, they said to me, we still have a problem with this word advocacy, because advocacy means a court of law. It's what happens in a court of law. And I said, you're no longer part of the Global Libraries program. You can call it what you like, And it's a kind of realization that they could change the vocabulary. It's fascinating. So that's the first one. It's the beware of cultural imperialism is my version. I've had a lot of fun with the foundation because from time to time I point out that some of the things that the Americans on the team are doing smacks of, American culture being exported to the world. As soon as I say that to them, they get panic-stricken. I've stopped doing it. It's it's too easy teasing. But of course, they do it all the time anyway. If you go to a conference organised by Americans, it is an American conference. It's not anything else. The next one is tell it, and this sounds a bit boastful, but I apologise for it, is tell it how it is, even if it hurts. I was employed as an independent consultant to Global Libraries, and I saw that as my brief. So if, for example, the director of Global Libraries wanted to move into the SIMS surveys, which I talked about, the Common Impact Measurement System, and I'm saying, this is the problem with this is that you're still keeping the simple logic model of engaging around evaluation in place, and it doesn't really work in complex situations. I'll unpack this over a drink afterwards if anyone wants to. But what I felt the necessity to do was to say to Deborah, you must remember the concept of emergent evaluation, which is that in a complex situation, you start collecting data to find out what is going on, and then you then decide on your focus for evaluation. She hated the idea. And in fact, my wife, Sharon Martis, who's the co-author of the book that I've given you details on, she said to me part of the way through this meeting, if you want your contract renewed, David, you're going to have to stop talking about emergent evaluation. And I said, sorry, I've got to continue because I think it's important. And at the end of the year, my contract was not renewed. But at the end of January, it was, because the countries started asking for me. And because they were, and the director of the programme, who I was in a kind of frosty relationship with at one stage, she recognised that the grantees wanted my contribution, my help, and so she, resurrected my contract, and I'm still there. And in fact, she took me out to dinner last week in Athens, so I think it must be better now. But who knows? So that's the second one: is tell it how it is, and that I think is something that's, to my mind, is what consultancy is really about. Never underestimate committed experts. And, if you're in a situation where you've got people whose first language is not English, second language may not be English, third language may not be English, it's tempting to assume that they're not very engaged or really committed. Forget it. The onus is then on us as consultants to chuck out the jargon, keep things as simple as possible, speak slowly, and And the boasting bit on that was that we have a process in global libraries called frogging, as in frogs. It just happened that when the idea came up, somebody had a lot of cartoon pictures of frogs, which they laminated and gave out to all of the tables at the conference. The idea being that if somebody was not understanding something, or if someone was speaking too fast, then the frog would go up.
Oh.
Every single member of the American team on global libraries has been frogged at least 3 times. I haven't been frogged yet. So it's about recognising that because people are maybe struggling with the language, it doesn't mean that they are not there and engaged and probably know a hell of a lot more about evaluation in their own setting than you do. So it's, try and build the bridges. And the last concept is the one that I've survived on as a consultant. I mean, the key one for me really is to treat each new situation that you go into as anthropologically strange. This is from social anthropology, where people going out to study primitive tribes are encouraged to not make assumptions, to go in and look at what's going on and treat each situation, even if you think you recognise it, treat it as strange. And that what's good for the social anthropologist is good for information consultants as well, as I've discovered. Because quite often I see what I think is something that I'm familiar with, and then I find out it doesn't actually work like that. I'll give you one example to close with. In Vietnam, the cultural post offices that I mentioned are under the remit of the Ministry of Information and Communications. The advocacy program is about engaging the library managers to advocate on behalf of public libraries. If that's successful, they will be advocating like mad, and the pressure will go on to the Minister of Information and Communications. Now guess where the Global Libraries Programme team for that country is based? In the Ministry of Information and Communications. So you can just imagine what will happen if the Minister gets a lot of flack coming through saying, these people appear to be organised. Who's doing that? Oh, it's that team in your ministry. And so what I was fully expecting, but the advocacy person was not expecting, even though I tried to warn her, when she went in, was that when she went to see advocacy at grassroots level in the country, it wasn't advocacy focused on trying to influence the policymakers' decision making. It was public relations to try and get the word out about public libraries. It was called advocacy, the advocacy training was provided, but it had a completely different focus. So that's one of many, I can think of many examples of this where, you think that you can see what's going on, you think you understand, but you just don't. And that, I guess, will be a summary of my life. Thank you.
Thank you, David.